The strange warning from a hiker. I never thought I'd encounter something like this. I've been a park ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park for the last 10 years, and I thought I'd seen it all: lost hikers, injured climbers, bad weather, and the occasional bear that got too curious. You get used to the routine. You start to think you know the woods, that you understand the patterns, the rhythms of the place. But the mountains, they have their own rules, and sometimes they don't follow any of them. This story, it started like any other summer evening. It was a quiet day in June, one of those clear blue sky days where the air feels light and crisp. The kind of day when the park draws in hikers and tourists from every corner of the country. The trails were busy with people eager to experience the rugged beauty of the Rockies. It was close to dusk when I received the call. A hiker was lost. First, it didn't seem like anything unusual. People get lost in the woods all the time. The park is vast, and even with all the signs and trails, it's easy to take a wrong turn, lose track of time, or wander off the beaten path. I've rescued plenty of hikers, and I was certain this would be no different. But as I headed toward the location where he was last spotted, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally, this part of the park, close to the timberline, surrounded by dense stands of pine trees, was alive with sound. Birds chirped, squirrels skittered through the underbrush, and the wind rustled the leaves. But tonight, there was nothing, just a heavy, suffocating quiet that hung in the air, making my skin prickle with unease. I found him about an hour later, huddled on the ground, his back pressed up against a rock. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his eyes, there was something strange about them. He looked up at me as I approached, and his expression was one of pure terror, like he'd seen something that shouldn't be seen, something that haunted him. "You found me," he said, his voice weak, trembling. You found me. Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. I've dealt with panicked hikers before, but there was something unsettling in his voice that made my stomach tighten. "What happened?" He shook his head, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "They were watching me, in the trees, watching me the whole time." I kneeled beside him, scanning the area. "Who was watching you? Did you see anyone else out here?" His eyes darted nervously around, as if expecting someone or something to leap out at any moment. "No, not people. They were not people. I don't know what they were. They were tall, and their eyes were glowing, like fire. I could feel them, always watching, always waiting." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You're safe now," I said, trying to reassure him. "Let's get you back to the ranger station." But he didn't move. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand. They're still here. They're still watching. You have to be careful. You have to watch the trees." His warning seemed so out of place, so irrational. It didn't make sense. But as I helped him to his feet and we started walking back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about the way he looked at the trees, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. It was as though he could still feel them out there, hiding just beyond the edge of the forest. When we finally made it to the parking lot, I radioed for backup and called in the rescue team. I told them what had happened, and they took the man into their care. He was physically fine, no serious injuries or dehydration, but his mind was another story. He was placed in a medical facility for observation. But every time someone tried to speak to him, he only repeated the same thing over and over again. "They're out there. They're still watching." I thought it was just the paranoia of a man who had been lost in the wilderness for too long, a product of exhaustion and fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to go back to the area where I'd found him, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for his bizarre story. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was just curious, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing out there, that it was just another lost hiker with a story too strange to be true. I retraced the path, the same one I'd walked the night before, The forest looked the same, silent, still, and darkened by the encroaching evening. But as I moved deeper into the trees, I noticed something odd. The ground, normally covered in thick pine needles and underbrush, was disturbed. There were deep impressions in the soil, large, almost animal-like footprints, but not quite. The shape was wrong, too large for any known creature in these parts. They were too wide, the toes too splayed, as if something had been walking through the forest with a gait that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I knelt down to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. The edges of the prints weren't blurred by dirt or weather. They were too clean, as if whatever had left them hadn't been touching the earth in the usual way. It was as though these prints had been made by something that hovered just above the ground, something that moved with a fluidity that defied nature. I felt a coldness creep into the air around me, like a presence, something watching from the trees. I looked up quickly, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing, just the same stillness, the same eerie silence. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, not from an animal. No, this sound came from something different, something that didn't belong in the forest. It was deep, echoing through the trees, vibrating in the ground beneath my boots. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. No, this wasn't right. I wasn't alone here. There was something else in these woods, something I couldn't see, but something I could feel, pressing in from all sides. I turned and started walking back toward the trail, faster now, my breath coming in quick gasps. My footsteps were the only sound I could hear, but I could still feel it, them following me, just out of sight, the feeling of eyes, burning into the back of my skull. When I reached the edge of the woods, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept walking, all the way back to the ranger station, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. I didn't tell anyone about the footprints, or the growl, or the feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods. I didn't want to seem crazy. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was all in my head. But that night, as I lay in my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that was still watching, and it wasn't human. Story number 2. The strange light at Glacier National Park. I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park for the better part of a decade, and I've seen my share of strange things. Some of them can be explained away by logic, weather patterns, or simple human error. But then, there are things that don't fit the mold. And what I saw that summer, what I felt, is something I still can't explain. It was a humid night in July, the kind of evening where the air is thick with moisture, and the sun doesn't seem to ever want to fully set. The sky was still painted in streaks of orange and purple, even as the clock pushed past midnight. I was doing my usual patrol through the backcountry trails, an isolated part of the park far from the campgrounds, the hotels, or any of the usual tourist spots. If you've ever been to Glacier, you know the feeling of being swallowed whole by the vast wilderness. The towering peaks, the dense forests, and the cold lakes all make you feel small, insignificant even, but in a good way. It's the kind of solitude you crave when you sign up for this kind of job. But that night, something felt different. I remember it clearly. I had just passed the foot of the mountain where the Going to the Sun road ends, and I was heading deeper into the forested region. The trail was narrow, lined with thick pines, their shadows swallowing up the fading light. My flashlight flickered faintly as I moved along, casting long, eerie beams through the trees. The sound of the forest, the chirping of insects, the rustling of leaves was oddly absent, replaced instead by an uncomfortable silence. You know that feeling, don't you? The kind of silence where it feels like everything around you has stopped breathing, waiting for something. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a normal night, but then I saw it. A light. First, I thought it was a campfire, or maybe some other ranger or tourist who had wandered off the beaten path. But no, this light was coming from deeper into the park, further away from any established trails. It was a pale blue, almost ghostly, and it danced through the trees, flickering like a candle in the wind. My first instinct was to investigate. I couldn't see anything from where I was standing, but the light kept moving, drifting in a direction I couldn't follow with my flashlight alone. I started walking toward it. First, my steps were steady, but with every stride I took, the air seemed to grow colder. First, I thought it was just the night temperature dropping, but the chill I felt wasn't like anything I had experienced before. It was a biting cold, the kind that sinks into your bones, like a presence, a warning. I kept going. The trees around me started to look different, as though the shadows were deeper, the branches heavier. The whole forest seemed to be holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but it wasn't just the forest. It felt like something else, something beyond my comprehension. The light, meanwhile, was getting brighter. I picked up my pace, eager to find the source, but each step I took toward it seemed to stretch the distance further. And then, without warning, the light disappeared. I froze. It wasn't like a light turning off, like someone flipping a switch. No, it was like it had never been there at all. One moment, it was burning so brightly it lit up the forest. And the next, it was just gone. But something remained. Presence. The feeling, like a weight had been placed on my chest. And the forest around me had shifted, as if it were now aware of my presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt the cold seeping through my jacket. I tried to call into my radio to report the strange light, but the static on the line was so thick. I couldn't hear a thing. The radio buzzed, crackled, and then died entirely. I cursed under my breath and tried to start it again, but nothing. The silence came rushing back, but it was worse now. I could feel the eyes of something in the trees, watching, waiting. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned around and began to retrace my steps, but I didn't make it far before the light reappeared. It flickered to life behind me, this time much brighter, casting long, twisted shadows across the trail. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest, now eerily quiet, seemed to hold its breath again. The light was closer now, closer than it had ever been, and it seemed to be drawing me in, pulling me toward it. I stumbled forward, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to turn and run, but my legs were no longer listening to reason. I found myself moving toward it, driven by some unseen force, my body acting on its own. And that's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, a growl, but not like any animal I had ever heard. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a mountain lion. It was deeper, darker, like something ancient, something not of this world. I froze. My breath came in shallow gasps. The air felt thick, suffocating. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The light was not just a light. It was attached to something. A figure, a shadow, tall enough that it seemed to tower over the trees themselves. His body was a silhouette of darkness, its outline flickering in and out of focus, as if it wasn't entirely there. The light surrounding it was not warm or welcoming. It was cold, harsh, and seemed to burn into my skin. I couldn't move. My feet were planted, frozen to the spot, but my mind was screaming. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but the light, the figure, it held me in place. The growl grew louder, closer, and then silence. The figure stepped forward. In that moment, I saw its face, or what could be called a face. It was a twisted, grotesque parody of a human's, with wide, glowing eyes, and a mouth too wide, too stretched, full of jagged teeth that seemed to grow and shrink with each breath it took. The light surrounding it pulsed, and the air around me seemed to bend. The figure loomed closer, his presence suffocating. I didn't dare move. My legs refused to work. My hands were shaking, and all I could hear was the thumping of my own heartbeat. The figure reached out, one elongated hand stretching toward me, and I finally found my voice. I screamed. I don't know how long I screamed, but the figure never flinched. It didn't back away. It didn't respond. It just stood there, its eyes glowing brighter, until finally, the light began to fade. And when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The silence came back, heavier than before. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold ground. The air was still, but it was no longer cold. The warmth of the desert night returned, but it didn't feel the same. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally managed to get back to my feet, the forest around me seemed different. I wasn't sure if the trees had always been like that, or if the world around me had somehow changed, but everything felt wrong. I ran. I didn't care if I got lost in the dark. I had to get away from whatever that thing was. I didn't look back, not even once. When I finally made it back to my truck, I didn't bother reporting what happened. What could I say? How could I explain what I had seen when I wasn't even sure I understood it myself? I don't patrol that part of the park anymore. I can't. Every time I try, that light, those eyes haunt me. And to this day, I don't know what it was. I don't know what that thing was. All I know is that when it disappears, it doesn't just vanish, it goes somewhere deeper, somewhere we're not supposed to go. Story number 3. The roar in the forest. I've worked as a park ranger at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming for over 12 years. There's a rhythm to it, the deep stillness of the mountain air, the rustling of the trees in the wind, the calls of the elk and the wolves echoing through the valleys. It's a place that feels alive, in the way a place can feel when it's untouched by time. But there's something else about Grand Teton, something that's harder to put into words. It's the way the shadows stretch, how the night seems to swallow you whole, and how the trees groan in a way that makes you question whether the wind is really to blame. I was out on my usual patrol one evening in the early spring, the day's fading light barely hanging on as I made my way through the park. The roads were empty, save for the occasional passing car, and the trailheads were quiet. It was the kind of evening where the silence presses in on you, heavy and suffocating, like the world is holding its breath. The sun had long since disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the mountains to grow dark and jagged against the sky. The moon was up, but it did little to dispel the shadows that clung to every tree and rock, every cliff and ravine. It was around 11 p.m. when I first heard it, the sound of a deep, rumbling growl, vibrating through the earth. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I'd been trained to recognize the calls of the animals in the park, the howls of wolves, the bugling of elk, even the distant roars of a mountain lion. But this wasn't any of that. This wasn't an animal I knew. First, I thought it might be a bear. Bears were starting to emerge from hibernation around this time, and they could be unpredictable, especially when they were hungry. But the growl, it wasn't the low, guttural rumble of a bear. It was deeper, more menacing, more unnatural. I quickly turned off the engine of my patrol truck and got out. Straining my ears, the growl came again, a long, reverberating sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. It echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. My instincts told me to stay calm, to rely on my training. But something was off. The sound wasn't right. It didn't belong in this place. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, but the moment I pressed the button to check in, the growl sounded again, closer this time. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. I didn't see anything, no movement, no eyes shining back at me, but the sound was still there, vibrating in the air like a warning. I stepped toward the source of the sound, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Every muscle in my body was taut, ready to react. Though I wasn't sure what to react to, I kept my flashlight trained ahead, hoping for something, anything that could explain this strange, unsettling noise. But there was nothing, just trees, and the sound, growing louder, and then silence. I stood frozen for a moment, the sudden quiet pressing in on me like a weight. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was no longer sure if the silence was a relief or a new kind of danger. And then, just as I was about to call it in to dispatch, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A man, or at least, that's what I thought at first. He was standing just beyond the trees, his face obscured by the shadows. But there was something strange about him. He was tall, too tall, and his outline was unnaturally broad. I couldn't make out his features, but I saw his eyes, red, glowing like embers in the dark. I froze. The man, or whatever he was, didn't move, but I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing down on me. It wasn't fear. Exactly, not yet. But it was something else. Something primal. Something that told me not to move, not to make a sound. But I couldn't help myself. My training kicked in, and I called out to him. "Hey, are you all right?" The figure didn't respond, and for a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. But then, slowly, his head tilted. I could feel his gaze on me, even though I couldn't see his eyes clearly in the dark. "You shouldn't be out here," I said, my voice sounding more uncertain than I meant it to. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. I was left standing there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. I stood there for a while, unsure of what to do. I wanted to call in the sighting, to report it, but something stopped me. A sense that whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt, was not something that could be explained easily. Not something that could be dealt with by a radio call or a report. The growl returned, this time more distant, but still present, lingering in the air. Reluctantly, I made my way back to the patrol truck, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I needed to get back to base. I needed to process it all, talk it through with someone. But as I drove back, the growl followed me. It wasn't constant, but it was always there, echoing through the trees, just out of reach. When I got back to the ranger station, I found a man sitting in the front lobby, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was a tourist, probably in his mid-30s, and he was shaking as he sat in one of the chairs. I approached him cautiously. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked. He looked up at me, his face stricken with terror. I saw something," he said, his voice shaking. "In the woods. Something big, with red eyes. It was walking on two legs. But it wasn't a man. It wasn't human." I felt my stomach drop. He had seen the same thing I had. "What exactly did you see?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know. It was dark, but it had eyes, red eyes, like glowing embers. It was following me," he said, his voice trailing off. I tried to calm him down, but my own heart was racing now. I was hearing the same thing he had seen, the same thing I had felt in the woods. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to believe. I filed a report, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the forest that night. Something had awakened, and whatever it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. No one could find any evidence of the creature we had encountered. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no explanation. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And from that night on, I never went into those woods alone again. Story number 4. The mysterious disappearance at Joshua Tree National Park. There are places in the world, remote and forgotten, that seem to hold their breath. As a park ranger at Joshua Tree National Park, I've spent most of my life in the wide open desert, walking between the twisted, gnarled Joshua trees, feeling the weight of the quiet like a heavy cloak. There's a certain peace in the vast emptiness. But peace, as I've come to know, can be deceiving. What you think is calm is often only the calm before something far darker. It was late October when it happened. The desert was already cooling down as the sun set behind the jagged mountains that framed the park. I'd been working for years at Joshua Tree, and I'd seen all manner of strange things. Abandoned vehicles, hikers gone off the trail, Tourists who thought they could handle the desert but found themselves lost in its unforgiving vastness. But this was different. It started like any other routine evening patrol. I was driving along the park's less traveled roads, the kind that aren't marked on many maps. This part of the park is known for being especially remote, miles of barren land, with only the occasional cluster of cacti and rock formations for company. The wind had picked up, sending dust swirls across the road as I rolled through the familiar territory. I was miles from the nearest campground when I spotted something unusual. A car. It wasn't parked on the side of the road like an abandoned vehicle usually would be. No, this one was parked off the main dirt trail, deeper into the desert, near the base of a rocky outcrop. What struck me as odd was that it didn't look like any of the cars I had seen on patrol that day. The windows were fogged up, the engine off, the headlights still faintly glowing like a ghost in the fading light. I slowed down and pulled over. Something didn't feel right about this. Everything about the scene screamed out of place. The area around me was desolate, with no other vehicles or signs of life. No hikers, no other rangers. The silence was oppressive. It felt like the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the car, and approached the vehicle. It was a late model SUV. Nothing special, except for the strange stillness that clung to it. I knocked on the window first, the dull sound reverberating through the emptiness. No response. I circled the car. The driver's side door was locked, but I could see the empty seat, untouched. It was like the driver had simply vanished into thin air. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of anything wrong, except for the eerie emptiness that pressed in from all sides. I started looking around for tracks, footprints in the dust, anything that could explain what had happened. And that's when I saw them. Huge footprints, long, wide impressions in the soft desert floor, leading away from the vehicle. My first thought was that they belonged to someone who had been out hiking, someone whose feet had sunk deep into the loose soil. But the more I looked at them, the less they made sense. They weren't the footprints of a person, at least not any person I'd ever seen. The tracks were too large, too deep, too deliberate. I followed the footprints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when they began to veer off into an area of the park I knew well. It was an area far away from any trail, an area even the most daring hikers wouldn't venture into. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the desert itself was closing in on me. My heart began to beat faster, the pulse loud in my ears as I stepped carefully around the sharp rocks, the dry sand crunching underfoot. The footprints led me to a small clearing, nestled between two large boulders. The area was so quiet it almost felt wrong, like there was no life here, nothing but the wind and the rocks. And in the center of that clearing, I saw it, a shape, something, or someone, was standing there. First, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, the figure did not move. It wasn't a person at all. It was a shape, humanoid, standing unnaturally still. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The air grew colder. Despite the warm desert night, there was no sound, not even the usual hum of insects or the whisper of the wind, just the oppressive silence and the strange figure in front of me. Then, it shifted, not in the way a person moves, no. It was like something slipping out of focus, like the air itself was bending around it. I blinked, disoriented, and in that instant, the shape was gone, just like that. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had been, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My mind raced. What the hell had I just seen? Was I hallucinating? Was I lost? I didn't know. I turned back to the tracks, my pulse racing, my eyes darting from one side to the other, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of where the figure had gone. I found nothing. The footprints stopped at the edge of the clearing, leading nowhere. The ground was untouched beyond that point. It was as if the figure had never been there. I hurried back to the car, my thoughts scattered, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to report this. I had to figure out what had happened. I could feel the dread settling deep in my stomach, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't go away. But when I reached the car, something was waiting for me. The windshield, a shape, a drawing. I stopped dead in my tracks. The windshield had a strange symbol drawn on it. It was crude, almost childlike in its simplicity, two intersecting circles, surrounded by jagged lines that resembled some sort of unholy sun. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't something that could be wiped away. The symbol was etched there, as though it had been burned into the glass. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that symbol. I felt a cold sweat creeping down my neck, my mind racing. Who had done this, and why? I reached out, trembling, and wiped my fingers across the glass. But nothing came off. The symbol remained. My hand shook as I fumbled with my radio, trying to report what had happened. But the static on the line was deafening. I couldn't make out anything, just static and crackles. And somewhere, deep in the desert, the sensation that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember much after that. I must have driven back to the station, but I can't recall the drive. I don't know how I made it back without losing my mind. In the days that followed, I went back to that spot. I looked for answers, tried to make sense of what I had seen, but there was nothing. No sign of the vehicle, no sign of the footprints, nothing. It was like the desert had swallowed it all up. I reported the incident, of course, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to exhaustion, or maybe even a bear or a mountain lion. They didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what I had seen. They hadn't felt the cold, the weight of the air, the oppressive silence that followed me back. I've been back to that spot once or twice, but every time I get close, I feel it again. That chill, the suffocating feeling that something is watching me. And the symbol on the windshield, I haven't been able to explain it. Still there, in my mind, like a mark I can never erase. And the worst part, I never found the person who drove the SUV, never heard from them again. There are no answers, just the lingering knowledge that someone is out there, in the desert, watching, waiting, and I'll never be able to forget it. Story number 5. The mysterious death at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I've been a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for over 20 years. People who don't live in the mountains think it's all quiet and picturesque. Rolling hills, misty mornings, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. But out here, there's something different, something heavy, something in the air that doesn't belong, lurking just out of sight. I felt it more times than I can count. But this story, this is the one I'll never forget. It was the summer of 1953 when it all started. Back then, I was still relatively new to the job, young, ambitious, with that naivety that only a person with little experience could have. The Smoky Mountains were a different world then, too darker, more remote, more dangerous. No cell phones, no GPS, just you and the woods. It was the perfect place to get lost, if you weren't careful, but we never thought much of it. We were trained to handle it. It was a quiet morning when the call came through, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy. Ranger Jenkins, the senior ranger who had been in the park for almost 30 years, was the one who took the report. A body had been found in the farthest reaches of the park, deep in the woods. I don't think anyone expected it to be anything serious at first. It wasn't uncommon for hikers or campers to get lost, to find themselves in danger, especially in those days when the wilderness was far more dangerous than it is now. But this was different. I was on patrol when I heard about it. A body found in the thick woods, near a place we called the Hemlock Hollow, a dense, dark part of the park that even the locals avoided. I wasn't assigned to the investigation, but my curiosity got the better of me. It always does. I was still young, still trying to prove myself, still too eager to jump into things. I decided to go check it out. When I arrived, Jenkins was already there, standing over the body, his face grim. The first thing I noticed was how strange the body looked. unnatural. There were no signs of struggle, no injuries from wild animals or human hands, no scratches, no bites, no cuts, just the body of a man lying face down in the dirt, his clothes dirty and torn, but mostly intact. But it wasn't the body itself that unsettled me. It was his face. The man's expression was frozen in a look of pure terror. His eyes were wide open, his mouth agape in a silent scream. It was the kind of look you see on someone who has just encountered something unspeakable, something that has torn away their ability to even scream, the kind of look you only see in nightmares. "Jenkins, what happened here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My stomach twisted as I stared at the man's face. "We don't know," Jenkins replied, shaking his head. "There's no sign of how he got here. No wounds, no nothing. It's like he just dropped dead." He ran a hand through his graying hair. But that face, whatever it was, it scared him to death. I looked at the body again, my heart pounding. There was something about the way the man's eyes were fixed, unnatural, almost as if they were staring straight into something invisible, something that I couldn't see. I felt it again, the heaviness in the air, like the weight of 1,000 eyes on my back. "I've called it in," Jenkins continued, his voice low. "They'll send someone to take the body, but I'm not sure what we're dealing with here. I've been in these woods for decades, but I've never seen anything like this." I didn't know what to say. I stood there for a while, trying to shake off the feeling crawling up my spine. When they took the body away, I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't, not by a long shot. A few days later, Jenkins disappeared. It happened just after sunset, while he was on his regular patrol. I remember the phone call clearly. Even now, the voice on the other end of the line, frantic and urgent, telling me that Jenkins had gone out to check a trail in the same area where the body had been found. They hadn't heard from him since. First, I thought maybe he'd gotten lost. It wasn't unusual. The Smoky Mountains are big, and sometimes the weather can change so quickly that even the most experienced rangers can find themselves off track. But when the hours turned into a whole day, then two, and there was still no sign of him, I started to get that same gnawing feeling I had when I saw that body, that something wasn't right. The search for Jenkins took days. We combed through the forest, scouring every inch of the Hemlock Hollow, following the trails, calling his name, praying he'd show up, but he didn't. I don't think anyone wanted to say it aloud, but we all knew it. He was gone, vanished into thin air, just like that. No trace, no evidence, nothing. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. After that, I started hearing things. It began with the whispering. I'd be walking down the trail in the dead of night, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I'd hear it just barely, like the sound of soft, unintelligible voices carried on the wind. It was faint, like a distant murmur, but it was always there, calling, watching. Sometimes, I'd turn my head and think I saw something moving in the corner of my vision. A shadow, maybe, a flicker of movement between the trees. But when I looked directly, it was gone. I wasn't the only one who heard the whispers. The other rangers did too. The ones who'd been around for a long time. The ones who knew the Smoky Mountains better than anyone. And they were all on edge. Something about the disappearance of Jenkins had unsettled them more than they let on. They didn't talk about it much, but I could tell. They were afraid of what might still be out there. And then, I found it. It was a few weeks later. Another quiet evening shift. I was walking the same trail where Jenkins had last been seen when I noticed something strange. A series of tracks, deep imprints in the earth, as if something heavy had passed through. First, I thought they might have been from Jenkins, but they were wrong. Too deep, too large. I followed the tracks, feeling that familiar sense of dread settle in my chest. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, and the air around me felt colder. Even though it was summer, the tracks led me to a clearing, to the same spot where Jenkins had found the body. And there, in the dirt, was something new, something that sent a chill down my spine. A hand, a human hand, but not like any hand I had ever seen. It was pale, almost ghostly, and it was twisted, as if the person who it belonged to had been trying to claw their way out of something. And there, lying next to it, was a torn piece of clothing, Jenkins' jacket. I don't know why, but I didn't want to touch it. I just stood there, staring at the hand, feeling the terror clawing its way up my throat. Something had taken him, something that left no trace, no evidence, no sign of struggle. It had simply taken him. I called for backup, but by the time they arrived, the hand was gone. To this day, no one knows what happened to Jenkins. They say the mountains are full of secrets, that some things are better left buried. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever took Jenkins, and whatever had killed that man all those years ago, was still out there, watching. I haven't been the same since that night. I hear the whispers sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, and every time I hear them, I can't shake the feeling that something is following me, waiting. I never go into those woods alone anymore, and I never will. Story number 6. The giant footprints. The thing about being a park ranger in a place like Olympic National Park is that you become accustomed to the silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you when the rain stops and the wind dies down. When the only sound you hear is your own breathing and the occasional creak of a tree. I've spent my life in places like this, dense forests, thick fogs, and mountains that seem to go on forever. But in all my years of working the trails, I've never encountered anything like what I found that winter. It was just past midnight when the snowstorm hit. The winds howled through the pines like an animal in pain, and the snow fell so fast, so thick, that it was as if the entire world was being swallowed by the storm. My partner, Dan, and I had been on patrol that night, checking the northern boundary of the park. It wasn't ideal weather for a routine check, but the storm had come out of nowhere. We were used to harsh weather out here, but this was different, violent, almost as if nature itself had decided to throw everything it had at us. We were supposed to return to base before the storm really picked up, but something stopped us. Something felt off. There was a deep, unnatural quiet that had settled over the forest, like the storm itself was holding its breath. We decided to make one last pass through a section of old-growth forest near the Quinault River before heading back. That's when we saw it. The snow had stopped falling for a moment, and the world was blanketed in a thick layer of white. The trees were heavy with snow, their limbs sagging under the weight. The ground was still and untouched, except for a series of footprints in the snow. But these were not just any footprints. These were enormous. They were easily 5 times the size of any human footprint I had ever seen. Dan and I exchanged a look. We had both been through the park long enough to recognize animal tracks. But this was something else. The prints were spaced too far apart, the stride too wide. The shape of them was all wrong. They weren't the rounded, clawed footprints of any bear, elk, or even cougar. These were humanoid, barefoot, yet somehow unnatural. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and the depth of the print, even with the snow falling heavily, seemed far too deep for something of the size we were dealing with. Dan, are you seeing this? I asked, my voice quiet, almost reverent. He nodded slowly. What the hell is that? We stood there for a moment, staring at the tracks. Then, instinctively, we both reached for our radios. This is Ranger Thomas. We found something out here. I need backup. My voice sounded distant, even to me, like I wasn't entirely sure what I was saying. I don't know why I felt the way I did, but it was as if the forest itself had changed. The air had gone thick with an unspoken tension. Felt like something was watching us. I glanced around, but the trees stood silently, unmoving. We followed the tracks deeper into the forest, unsure of what we were hoping to find, but unwilling to leave until we did. The snow was thicker now, the night darker, but the footprints were undeniable. They led us toward a clearing, a place where the trees opened up slightly, allowing the moonlight to spill through the canopy. And that's when we saw it. a shape tall, looming, hunched over slightly, like something that didn't belong in the world of men. The thing was partially hidden behind a thick clump of ferns, but the silhouette was unmistakable. I could feel my heart beating so loudly I thought it would burst from my chest. "Dan," I whispered, but he wasn't next to me. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. Dan was gone. I took a step back, then another. My legs felt like lead, my breath coming in short bursts. I turned my head, searching for him. That's when I heard the noise. A low, guttural growl. I turned back toward the shape in the clearing, but it was gone. Just like that, vanished into the night, as if it had never been there at all. My pulse was racing. I didn't know what to make of it. My mind was fighting against the thought, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself that I had seen nothing. But I knew, deep down, I had seen something. "Dan!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the cold air. A rustling noise came from behind me. I spun around just as Dan emerged from the shadows, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Where the hell did you go?" I asked, relief washing over me. I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. I turned around for a second, and then it was like something grabbed me. Couldn't move, couldn't see. It was like something was right there, just out of my sight. "Did you hear that growl?" I asked, desperate for some explanation. Dan nodded, but didn't speak. We both stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the forest. No more growls, no more movement. The storm had picked up again, and the wind was starting to howl through the trees. I had never been so scared in my life. We didn't stay much longer after that. We made our way back to the truck, our nerves frayed and our eyes darting over our shoulders, half expecting something to leap out at us from the darkness. We radioed for backup, but when the other rangers arrived, the footprints were gone. The snow had fallen so heavily that the forest floor had been wiped clean. There was no sign of what we had seen, nothing but the storm and the deep silence of the woods. The following days brought an unsettling stillness to the park. We never found any more prints, no more signs of the creature we had encountered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching us, that it was still out there, lurking in the depths of the forest. I'm still a park ranger today, but I haven't gone back to that section of the park since that night. I've avoided it, and whenever the wind picks up and the trees start to creak in that particular way, I feel a chill crawl down my spine. I don't know what we saw that night, if it was a bear, or some other animal, or something far worse. But I do know one thing, whatever it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again, and I don't think I ever will. Story number 7. The Ghost of the Missing Hiker. I've been a park ranger for over 12 years at Yellowstone, and there are days when it feels like I've seen every corner of the park, from the boiling geysers to the snow-capped peaks of the mountains. Every inch of it feels familiar to me. You get used to the silence, the vastness, the way the wilderness stretches out, seemingly endless. But there's one part of Yellowstone that has always unsettled me, part one can't fully explain, no matter how many times I've tried. It was late autumn when it happened, and the park was quieter than usual. Tourists had begun to thin out, leaving behind the solitude that I had come to love. The weather had been changing. The crisp fall air was turning colder, and the nights were growing longer. I got a call that morning about a missing hiker, a tourist from out of state who had gone off-trail the previous afternoon and hadn't returned by dark. We were used to this, people getting lost in the park, wandering off the marked paths, thinking they could navigate the backcountry on their own. It wasn't uncommon for us to get the call, and it wasn't uncommon for us to find them within a few hours. But that day, something felt different. I had been assigned to a team of rangers to search a section of the park near the Old Faithful area, a dense forest with craggy rocks and thick underbrush. We had split up into pairs, methodically combing the area, calling out for the missing man. His name was Andrew Thomas, a 35-year-old software engineer from Seattle. He had been visiting Yellowstone with his wife, and from what I'd heard, he was an experienced hiker, someone who knew the woods, but for whatever reason, he'd gotten lost. I'd been walking for hours when it happened. I was alone by then, my partner having taken another section of the forest. The wind had picked up, whipping through the trees in gusts that made it feel like the forest was alive, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I was getting tired, my feet sore from trudging through the thick underbrush. When I heard it, Jonah, the voice was soft, distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It took me a moment to process it. I paused, my heart suddenly racing, and looked around. The forest was quiet again. The wind had stilled for a moment, and there was nothing but the rustling of dry leaves underfoot. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Jonah. This time, it was clearer. I didn't know what to think. No one had called my name out here. My partner was too far away to shout to me. I was alone, or so I thought. Jonah came again, more insistent now, almost as if the voice was coming from just behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to my sidearm, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty forest stretching out into the fading light of day. I should have turned around then. I should have gone back to the team, but something kept me there. Something made me take a step forward, deeper into the trees, into the silence. I walked for a few more minutes, the voice fading but never quite disappearing, always just at the edge of my hearing. And then, as I passed through a thicket of trees, I saw it. There, standing in the clearing ahead, was a figure, a man, tall, with broad shoulders and the posture of someone who had been standing still for far too long. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. It was like it was waiting. The shape was blurry at the edges, as if the figure was not entirely there, like a smudge on the landscape, a part of the world that shouldn't have been. I called out, but my voice felt small in my mouth, barely a whisper in the vast emptiness. Andrew, I asked, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't him. The figure didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward. The forest was eerily still, as if the very air was holding its breath. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but my legs moved forward, carrying me closer to the strange figure. I was only a few feet away when the thing turned its head, slowly, impossibly slowly, as if it had been waiting for me to come closer, as if it knew I would. And when it looked at me, I felt a chill shoot through my body. The face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look straight through me. It wasn't Andrew Thomas, it couldn't be, but it was something else, something that belonged to the woods, something that should never have been. The eyes, they were empty, black as night, and there was a strange, almost mechanical stillness to the figure, like it wasn't quite human, like it was caught between worlds. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a low, rasping sound, like wind through dry leaves, filled the air, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, just a rustle of leaves, a brief shifting of shadows, and then nothing. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my pulse racing. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. I'd heard the voice, seen the figure, felt the weight of its presence in my bones, and yet I couldn't explain it. I was alone in that forest, but I wasn't. There was something with me, something that didn't belong. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I found my partner, who was searching the other side of the trail. I was shaking, covered in sweat, my heart still racing. I couldn't tell him what I'd seen. Not then, not yet. We searched for hours more, but we never found Andrew Thomas. By the time night fell, we called off the search. The team scoured the area for days, but nothing came up. No body, no sign of struggle. The only thing we found were strange marks in the dirt. Marks that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. I never reported what happened in the woods that day. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about the voice, the figure, the eyes that seemed to see right through me. I thought about it for days, weeks even, but I never spoke a word. Who would believe me? I was a park ranger, not some frightened tourist with an overactive imagination. But here's the thing, I can still hear that voice sometimes. Late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, when the park is quiet, I swear I hear it calling my name, Jonah, and every time I hear it, I remember the shadow in the woods, and I wonder if Andrew Thomas was ever truly lost, or if something else was waiting for him out there, something that took him, something that I couldn't see but could feel, just beyond the edge of my vision. I'm not sure what it was that I saw that day, but I'm certain of one thing, it wasn't human, and I don't think I'll ever be the same. Story number 8. The Ghost of Shenandoah National Park. I've been a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park for more than 15 years now. The job was everything I'd ever wanted. Peaceful, quiet, surrounded by nature. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretch endlessly in front of you, and there's a kind of solace in the routine of it all, patrolling the trails, keeping the park safe, and ensuring the wildlife remains undisturbed. But then, a few months ago, something happened that shattered the calm of this place. Something that has haunted me ever since. It started on a routine evening patrol. I was assigned to the westernmost trail, an old, winding path that leads up to the peak of Hawksbill Mountain, the highest point in the park. Not many people hike that trail. It's remote, isolated, overgrown in parts. Most tourists stick to the more well-known routes. But I've always liked the quiet of the less traveled trails, the ones that seem to belong only to the wind and the animals. I was about 2 hours into my patrol when I first noticed it. The feeling, you know the one, that sensation that someone is watching you. I felt it before, out here in the woods, but it's always been fleeting, a product of the vastness around me. After all, the forest has its own rhythm, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. But that day was different. I had just crossed a small bridge, my boots crunching against the gravel, when I heard it, a soft, unmistakable sound behind me, footsteps, the sound of heavy boots pressing against the earth, coming closer. It was strange because I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. No hikers, no fellow rangers. The area had been completely empty when I'd started my patrol. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone, a late hiker, maybe another ranger, but there was no one there. The path was empty, just the dense trees stretching out on either side. No sign of anyone. I stood there for a few seconds, my pulse quickening, but nothing. The air was still, too still. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. But as I turned back and started walking again, the footsteps came again, closer this time. I stopped, listened, nothing. At this point, my mind was racing. I considered calling in. Maybe it was just someone who had strayed off the main trail, but something about it felt wrong, too deliberate. I took a deep breath and continued walking, faster now, my senses on high alert. My eyes darted to the trees around me, the shadows lengthening as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I was a ranger. I'd been trained to handle emergencies, to keep calm in the face of danger. But this was different. Then, something even stranger happened. As I neared a bend in the trail, I saw movement ahead. A figure. It was a man, walking in front of me on the trail. His back was turned, his head slightly bowed, as if he was in deep thought. I froze for a second, unsure whether to call out to him or approach quietly. But before I could decide, he disappeared, gone, vanished into the trees, like a shadow, swept away by the wind. I called out, but there was no answer. I rushed forward, scanning the trees, but the trail was empty, no sign of the man. My heart was pounding now, my hands clammy with sweat. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. A thought occurred to me, one I didn't want to entertain, but I had to. I remembered a story that had been whispered among the rangers. a story about a hiker who went missing on this very trail. Years ago, tourist, a young man who had wandered off the path and never been found. The park had searched for weeks, but there had been no trace of him, nothing. They declared him dead. But some of the older rangers, those who had been around for a long time, swore they could feel him still out there, that his spirit hadn't left the park. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but that night, walking alone through the darkening woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I called it in to dispatch and told them I was heading back to base. But when I reached the trailhead, there was no one waiting for me, no other rangers, nothing. That night, couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the man, his figure, his face, just out of reach in the trees. I kept hearing those footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing behind me, like something was following me wherever I went. I tried to brush it off. I had to, but it didn't go away. Not the next day, or the day after that. The footsteps continued. I'd hear them every time I was out on patrol. Though I never saw anyone, they followed me through the forest. Behind me, beside me, always just out of sight, just enough to make my skin crawl. And when I thought I could take no more, when I thought I was losing my mind, I would see it again, the figure, standing just ahead of me on the trail. The first time it happened, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. It was just a shape, a man's silhouette, standing motionless in the middle of the path. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his eyes, burning into me from the shadows. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the stillness. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. I took a step closer, my hand resting on the holster of my sidearm, just in case. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, vanished into the trees. I didn't call anyone, couldn't. I didn't know what I was seeing. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was the isolation, the long hours spent in the woods, alone. But it wasn't just once. It happened again and again. Every time I went out there, I saw the figure. Every time I heard the footsteps, I would turn around and find the trail empty. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers, the sightings, the feeling that something was wrong. It all built up until I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. I was a wreck. I had to do something. So I went to the ranger who had been here the longest, Ranger Marlowe. He had been around since the park was first established. And if anyone knew something about the strange happenings around Shenandoah, it was him. I didn't even have to say much. As soon as I mentioned the footsteps and the figure, he gave me a look, one that told me he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and grave. "There's something you need to see." He led me to a part of the park I had never been to before, deep into the woods, far from the usual trails. We hiked for hours, the sun setting behind us. The further we went, the quieter it got, until it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, we arrived at a clearing, and that's when I saw it. A small, weathered plaque, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. It was old, so old I could barely read the engraving. It read, "In memory of David Thornton, lost in these woods, never found." Marlowe's voice was soft as he spoke. David Thornton. He was the man who went missing years ago. He was last seen right here, in this very spot. Some say his spirit still haunts these woods, searching for a way back home. I felt my stomach tighten. I had heard the story before, but hearing it from Marlowe, hearing it with the weight of his voice, the somber look in his eyes, it hit me harder than I expected. "He never made it out," Marlowe continued, his gaze distant. "And it's said that he'll never leave these woods, that he's still out there, calling to anyone who will listen." I didn't know what to believe. Was I hearing the voice of a lost soul? Or was it just the wind? The mountains have a way of making you question things you think you know. But as I stood there, in the fading light, I realized one thing. I had never truly been alone in these woods. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that David Thornton was always there, somewhere in the trees, following me, watching me, and no matter how many times I tried to leave it behind, the footsteps would always be there, just behind me, waiting. Story number 9. The Eyes in the Dark. I've worked as a park ranger in Yosemite National Park for nearly 10 years. And to be honest, I thought I had seen it all. The dense forest, the towering cliffs, the wild animals that roamed the trails. Nothing surprised me anymore. I had my routine, my nightly patrols, and everything had its rhythm. But that night, everything changed. It was late, later than usual. The usual flow of hikers and tourists had thinned out, and the park had quieted down to that eerie stillness that only comes when the sun has fully set and the shadows stretch long across the land. It was the kind of night where the wind whispers in the trees, and the cricket's song is interrupted only by the occasional rustling of the leaves. The air felt colder than usual, too, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. But I was used to it. This is the job I signed up for. I was out on my usual route, making sure the campgrounds were cleared out, the park was secure, and no one was lingering where they shouldn't be. It wasn't unusual to see the occasional flickering light in the distance, the tail lights of a car, or maybe a flashlight from some lost hiker, but this time, the light was different. It was far off, past the tree line, glowing with an intensity one hadn't seen before. It didn't flicker like a lantern or a headlamp. It was steady, unnaturally bright. I paused and squinted into the night, trying to make sense of it. The light didn't seem to move, and it wasn't like any flashlight I had ever seen. It almost looked like the headlight of a vehicle, but there were no roads out there, nothing but forest and wilderness. My instincts told me it was probably nothing, just some campers who had stayed out later than they should have. But something about the light felt wrong. I grabbed my radio and called in to the station. "This is Ranger Daniels. I spotted a light off trail, near the old Oak Hollow site. I'm gonna check it out." There was a brief crackle over the radio, followed by the dispatcher's voice. "Roger that. Daniels, be careful. Let us know if you need backup." I didn't respond, but I didn't need to. The park was large, and I knew the risks of patrolling alone at night. But I wasn't one to shy away from a little extra work. I figured a few hikers had gotten lost or set up camp in the wrong place. Nothing I couldn't handle. I made my way toward the light, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The trees around me seemed to grow thicker, closer together, as if the night itself was closing in. I wasn't scared, at least, not yet, but a nagging feeling gnawed at me. The kind of feeling you get when something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. As I got closer, I noticed the light wasn't really a light at all. It was more of a glow. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, like it was hovering in the air, not attached to anything. No tent, no campfire, no lantern, just a cold, ghostly light that illuminated the forest floor in an unnatural way. I called out, my voice echoing off the trees. "Hey, anybody out there?" Silence, not a sound, not even the wind. I took a few more steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest now. I was close enough to see that the glow wasn't a source of light. It was something else, something that didn't belong. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to get close, the light vanished. It didn't flicker out, like a dying flame, simply disappeared, like it was never there at all. In its place, standing between the trees, was a figure, a tall, thin figure, the kind of figure that should have been a shadow, but was too dark, too solid to be cast by anything in the surrounding forest. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was massive, towering over the trees. It stood motionless, watching me. Its eyes were the only thing visible, two glowing orbs that burned like the brightest stars in the sky. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I tried to call out, to speak, but no words came. I reached for my radio, but my hands shook so violently I couldn't get a grip on it. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me with those unblinking eyes. I don't know how long we stood like that, me, frozen in place, and it, towering above me, its eyes never leaving mine. Time seemed to stretch, bend, until the very air around us thickened. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of strange dream where I couldn't wake up. And the longer I looked at it, the more I felt like I was losing myself. And then, without warning, it was gone, just vanished. One moment, it was there, and the next, there was nothing, not even a footprint in the snow, not a rustle in the trees, just the haunting emptiness of the forest around me. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was hammering in my chest, and every inch of my body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there. But my legs wouldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. Something just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I snapped out of it. I bolted. I didn't care about protocol. I didn't care if I had to leave the radio behind, or the flashlight, or my jacket. I ran, straight back toward the patrol cabin, my heart pounding in my ears. I made it back to the station without looking over my shoulder once. Couldn't. I didn't want to see those eyes again. I didn't want to know what they were. The next day, I told my fellow rangers about what had happened, but they didn't believe me. Not really. They chalked it up to exhaustion, or maybe a trick of the light. But I know what I saw. I know those eyes were real, and whatever that thing was, still out there, somewhere in the darkness of Yosemite. I still patrol the park, but I never go out alone at night anymore. And every time I walk through the trees, I feel like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows and remind me that I'm not alone in the dark.